Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aseta. I'm your host, and this is episode number 10, The Big Spiritual Shift from Competition to Cooperation. However, what I announced in the title is not going to be where I start. I'm actually going to start with a little talk about eldering and why I'm including it and putting it first. It's the goal to which most of what I'm showing you points to. And I'm using it to try to show the importance of the shift I go into in the part that follows eldering, in the actual shift part. I debated with myself how to present this, and I decided to put the shift from competition to cooperation second. So in effect, I'll be talking about a shift and a related opportunity, which is that of becoming an elder, and how that can be a very important part of your legacy. For some of this first part, I've drawn on the book Aging to Saging, A Profound New Vision of Growing Older by Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi. I hope I didn't butcher that too badly. I actually found out a while later that he preferred to go by Reb Zalman, so I'm very glad to use what he preferred. He says that our images of aging are more the problem than aging itself. That's a direct quote. And it certainly fits in with what I've seen in other places and what I've used myself, that how we think about aging has a very dramatic effect on how we age. So let me quote him again. Our images of aging are more the problem than aging itself. And I would ask you to consider, maybe not right now, but what are your images of aging? Especially of you aging or your aging. Can you see that there might be some problems stemming from them, or do you feel like you're in pretty good shape? But I would recommend you take some time and actually give some thought to his statement, because it's a very important one, I believe. Reb Zalman goes on to say that our culture views aging as a process of gradually worsening personal diminishment and disengagement from life. And he says, we need to view old age as the culminating stage of spiritual development. That's quite different from what our culture says. And then I came across this following quote from a doctor in a magazine. I don't remember the name of the magazine or how long ago I read it, but hopefully it was not too recently, and maybe they've caught up to the times a little bit. But this is a direct quote from the article. He said that successful adjustment to the later years may be contingent upon the elderly person's ability to recognize his limitations, to give up work gradually, and to devote an increasing proportion of his time to leisure activities. I don't really take exception to the words at their face value. I think as we get older, we do have to recognize our limitations, and we probably will or have already had to give up work gradually, or at least some work. The devoting an increasing proportion of our time to leisure activities, certainly I'm not against leisure activities, but I might have the biggest problem with that. Overall, though, I wonder, how inspiring do you find that quote as a plan for living out the remainder of your life? To me, it seems like a prescription for disengaging from life. But it is your call. How you live out your later years, your retirement, your second half of life is up to you. Returning to Reb Zalman, he poses a parallel or comparison to senior citizen or sage. And he says aging points to becoming a senior citizen, which equals, his words, a static, lifeless condition where all further organic growth has ceased. Saging, on the other hand, he describes as a process that enables older people to become, listen to this one, spiritually radiant, physically vital, and socially responsible elders of the tribe. Compare that to devoting most of your time to leisure activities. And Reb Zalman adds, quoting again, eldering implies that we take responsibility for our destiny in old age. We not only take responsibility for our destiny, but we do the work necessary to give back to our society and the world from our accumulated experience and wisdom. And what he says next is very tied, I believe, to the shift from competition to cooperation. He describes the movement in elders is away from personal ego and ambition towards contributing to the common good. It's inward and deeper. And a quote of his that I loved the first time I read it was, elders don't have the last word, they have the deep word. Having the last word sounds an awful lot like competition, but having the deep word implies that the elder has gone deeper, has reflected on his experience or her experience, and has come to some conclusions that contain wisdom because of it. In this next segment, Reb Zalman is quoting somebody else, and I unfortunately lost that reference. But he was describing that elders become, and he's quoting someone else here, but certainly consistent with what he talks about, become teachers and mentors, mediators, monitors, mobilizers away from self-interest and towards the common or public good. Mediation, for instance, is very different from competition, and the monitoring that he or his source described was anywhere from monitoring your local township town hall meeting or Congress, watching always for the common good and derelictions from it. So at this point, I make somewhat of a plea that we need elders. Our country, our family, the world needs elders. And that would be elders who have worked at becoming an elder. And that is definitely work for the second half of life, or roughly our retirement years, which parallel it by and large. When you think of it, there are a lot of us. I live in an area with one of the highest concentrations of people over 65 in the country. And we could do a lot of good. Elders can bring the second half of life principles to the table rather than a lot of conflict. And elders, most of us have the time. After years of raising children, maybe working exhausting hours at our jobs and all the things that occupied us in the first half of life and somewhat beyond. In fact, for many people in the second half of life or retirement, the issue is what to do with their time. So yes, elders have time, but in a way that we also don't have time. Because I know that as I sit here today recording this, I have less time left than I did yesterday or a year ago or when I was 20 years old. And I do feel some urgency to share with people what I believe might help regarding our second half of life and our aging, growing older. One of my favorite lines that George Burns used to say was, at my age, I don't buy green bananas anymore. And I now realize I'm probably around the age or getting close to it that he was when he made that statement. There's a related issue here as well, and it brings me to the topic of the legacy we leave. I'm only going to mention it briefly here in relation to the shift from competition to cooperation, which is the second part of my talk today. I think in a way the money or property or material goods that we leave for our loved ones or others, certainly very important. it could be considered, in a sense, at least on the receiver's end, rather first half of life, since they are acquiring what we're giving to them in the way of material property. It's more acquisition. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I think we as elders could help everyone if we go further. So I'm talking here more from a spiritual or second half of life perspective. I've talked with a number of elders who are concerned about the world their children and grandchildren are going to inherit, and they want to do something. And I too am concerned. In fact, I finally wrote and self-published a book specifically for my children and grandchildren and maybe great-grandchildren and beyond. I wanted somehow to prepare them and support them in what could be a very difficult world to live in when I was no longer here. My older brothers and sisters were part of the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw called them. They survived the Great Depression. They fought and won the Second World War, or certainly were a major factor in it, and a large part of the free world felt greatly in debt to us when that war was over. And then many of them came home and studied on the GI Bill and made something of themselves and continued to contribute to society. I came from a very large family with many uncles and aunts and cousins. And I went back and did little biographies, sort of, on each one of them, some of whom my older children had known and remembered from when they were young, some they had never met, had died before, and tried to bring them to life to show how overall they had helped each other to survive the Great Depression and to go on and live either as a civilian or as a soldier during wartime, and to show them how important it was to care for each other, to support each other, to hang together, to share. So I didn't talk in generalities, but I wound up using the family history juxtaposed over the various events of the time. I grew up during the late 30s and early 40s, and then I traced all the way through the post-war happenings, the changes in our society, and so on. Initially, I just made copies for my children and grandchildren, but then I realized that there was something here for other members of the extended family too, so I also sent copies to cousins and some other people who were related one way or another, and was surprised how much they related and reacted, even though the book was intended primarily for my daughters. I gave my daughters the instructions then to, when their children were old enough, to give them their copy of the books. I wrote a dedication to each one, and then for them to pass on their copies to their children when the time came, in hopes that whatever was going on in the world then, what I had to say would be some help to them, primarily from grounding them in where they came from and of the importance of community and faith and caring for the common good and various other aspects that would help them through whatever they were going to face. And later, when my daughters became concerned about the possibility of those books getting pretty tattered and falling apart, I also converted it to an audiobook and put it on YouTube. And I don't know whether YouTube will last longer or the books will last longer, but one way or another, I was trying to cover both areas. So not only the book will be the physical book or audio book will be part of my legacy to my children and grandchildren, but also the words, the thoughts, the loves, the appreciation for family, and anything that was reflected in the book. And one of my adult nephews, he's in his early 60s now, who's not married, did not have children, he commented, he said, "Wow, I really caught the love for your family when I read that." I believe what we do as elders, what we leave behind, more perhaps in the spiritual realm, in the caring, and trying to help people in various ways would be a very significant part, even if we didn't have a dime to leave to our loved ones. Okay, I hear my reminder that it's time to put in an infomercial here. It will be brief and mainly for people who may be listening to the podcast for the first time. I want to let you know the other ways you can access the podcasts. You can get to them on my small website, retirementwithmeaning.com. We'll have all the podcasts and some information about me and about what the podcast is about. They will also appear on my timeline, Retirement with Meaning, on Facebook. And they are also on YouTube. You can go to YouTube and either search Retirement with Meaning or just my name, Carmen Accetta, Accetta. In addition, I make brief posts on my Facebook page, and usually they bring you back to or guide you to the podcast in order to get more information. But you can get at least the basics or the Cliff's Notes version briefly on my timeline. And you can sign up to be a follower so that whatever I post will go directly to your Facebook page or your feed. Okay, now I'll get to the topic that was billed as the very important shift from competition to cooperation. This shift is a little tricky, I believe, just as the shift from doing to being could be somewhat complex, and just as important as the shift from doing to being, if not more so. And I say if not more so because I believe this shift from competition to cooperation impacts the common good more noticeably, especially over time. And this one requires some thought. It's not clearly black and white, at least to most people. And you might have more natural resistance to this one, I think. And that's natural. The shift from competition to cooperation is especially important in our time, I believe. In the early history of the world, when people were just beginning to come together as tribes or joining one family to another in order to increase their chances for survival, it was necessary to compete. They had to find and protect their water source, their source of food, have some safe place to be, safe from animal predators, competing individuals, or tribes if they had gotten to that point. And it was very basic. It was survival. It was food. It was water. It was safety. There were no hidden political motives or hidden pacts or agendas or people profiting from their conflict and combat. It was simply to be able to stay alive and continue their family or their culture. If they couldn't compete, they were wiped out, or maybe as progressed would not be a good word, but as they moved forward, they would become enslaved. Now we face a very different situation, although it may seem the same to some people, that if the entire world doesn't learn to cooperate, we could all be wiped out and our world destroyed or left uninhabitable. Unfortunately, the offshoot of competition can be aggression and conflict. But the world desperately needs to cooperate for everyone's survival, for the survival of the planet itself. And competition can be done in a way, and probably most often is, that contributes to the polarization and the conflict that has now become one of the plagues of our times. I doubt that there are many people who are not aware that we have become increasingly polarized over the years. And if you think of a classic televised political debate, we see that people who either are our leaders or want to become our leaders can't even seem to disagree civilly with each other. They ridicule and attack. They don't hear the other person out. They talk over them. And it's gotten to be so that if you're not with me, you're one of them, the enemy somehow. And unfortunately, this polarization seems to occur anywhere from the playground to the highest halls of government, to church, to business, just about anywhere where people can have the opportunity to disagree. As I said, I believe this is one of the shifts that we're likely to have some resistance to. One, for the person that says, I'm good at competing. I win all the time. If I move over to cooperation, I'll be losing, my position of power. I worked hard to compete well. If the other person didn't work as hard, why should they benefit just because I did? Or somebody could very easily say, what? Go from competition to cooperation? Well, that's no fun. Or sounds like communism or socialism to me. And you might very naturally, understandably, share in some of that resistance, or perhaps you have your own personal barrier you can anticipate that is different from the ones that I just mentioned. I want to quickly say that competition is not bad in itself. It's natural, and it's even necessary in the first half of life. If you've listened to any of my podcasts that included the first half of life, that's what we do. Is the first half of life is about acquiring an education, acquiring a home, acquiring a job, acquiring a spouse or a partner. It's a lot about acquiring things we need for then and for the future. And we generally have to compete for jobs and so forth. And also, at least some of the time, it can be done fairly, with mutual respect, with honesty. We can learn discipline in the process. We can learn that competition can draw us to give our very best effort. We can learn about commitment to a cause, to others, to ourselves. We can learn to respect an opponent, or that the opponent is a person too, and not just an opponent. And we can grow capacities that we might not have acquired without taking on the challenges that we did, that the challenges brought out of us what we normally wouldn't have contacted just on our own. The downsides of competition can be awfully big, though. And one is that the biggest and the strongest and the one with the most resources almost always wins. And that access to the resources is not always equal. Competition can turn unfair and often does, and that can create great inequality. The need to win can create often unacknowledged serious collateral damage. And then I wonder what happens to the common or the public good, and what happens when the common good is neglected over significant time. I have a friend who has done work in Haiti for the last 35 years, maybe longer, and has done nothing but good there to help out. And yet the situation has gotten so bad there that he's been told, don't come, it's too dangerous. Haiti, I learned from him, was once a beautiful, thriving, Ireland in the Caribbean, until other nationals came in, benefited from what the country had to offer, and of course, from working with crooked politicians or leaders, and then left, leaving them pretty destitute until now. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and that conditions there are absolutely horrible. And many times the large egos often involved in big stakes competition can damage the process and destroy trust and honest communication for others. And even if that individual has moved on, the legacy can be one of making it very difficult to clean up the mess. So if we can't over time shift to cooperation, individually we remain at a lower level of consciousness than where some problems can't be solved. If you remember my quote from Albert Einstein or one or two of my previous podcasts, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And that level of consciousness that says compete and win and let the loser take care of himself is not a high enough level of consciousness to solve many problems. That the move to cooperation is a move up in the level of consciousness and then gives us access to solving some problems that couldn't be solved by competition. The good that can come from that shift for the individual would be just that, the move to a higher level of consciousness and spiritual growth, not having to operate in conflict so often, leaving as part of our legacy a healthy, mutually accepted processes in place so others don't have to keep reinventing the wheel and having an easier time of conflict resolution or competition. From the Sermon on the Mount, which many people, even if they are not Christians, know, the Beatitudes, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And blessings can not only come to the peacemaker, but to the people who have helped to make the peace for. If nothing else, there's even a lot more energy saved to apply to other aspects of our life than the large amounts that are consumed by competition and conflict and lack of trust. Good for a society can come from cooperation, that peace and the lack of conflict at various levels and the benefits that come from peace and lack of conflict. Issues get resolved instead of festering for generations and erupting into even more hatred and conflict, sometimes hundreds of years later. We've seen that in many parts of the world where people are fighting over things they probably don't even remember the origin of. But they know that they feel a need for revenge or to protect themselves or whatever the agenda of the time is. And cooperation produces win-win situations where people feel good when it's all over and not resentful and not wanting revenge. It can help moderate difficult processes and keep them from escalating, build trust and respect, help make the next time easier, and help people to feel better just because they're being heard. And I don't have to tell you that the stakes are very large. We just have to look, for instance, to the Ukraine, and not just to what's happening to the poor people there and the combatants, but also what could happen if that escalates and spreads and becomes a global issue. What I've been talking about sort of reminds me of when I used to do couples counseling. And one of the questions I often found myself asking the couple after I'd been with them for a while and could see how they put their relationship together, that I would suggest to them that they decide, do they want to win or do they want to be in relationship? Because if you win, you may well do that. You won, but now the relationship is over. Or you bred such resentment in the other person that you're going to pay for it daily. Their resentment is going to have impact on you. Unfortunately, I think the honest answer to that question was often, I want to win. And parenthetically, they wanted me to help prove that they were right. Well, let me see if I can sum up some of what I've been talking about here for you. First, that competition is normal for the first half of life. You're not saying you're a bad person because you're competing. And in the second half of life, I'll go back to Reb Zalman and quote him again, that the movement in elders is away from personal ego and ambition towards contributing to the common good. It's inward and deeper. And my favorite saying of his, that elders don't have the last word, they have the deep word. We've done the competition, the acquisition, the ego stuff, most of us, and we don't really need it anymore. We can drop it in the second half of life as a spiritual movement for us, and one that not only we but others will benefit from. And in the second half, our happiness comes more from meaning, not from what we've acquired. And the meaning is based more on who we are rather than what we do. Or if you feel more comfortable with it, maybe from what who we are produces. Let me say that again. From what who we are produces. Also, as with the shift from doing to being, this shift isn't a matter of either or. I remember at one of the talks I gave on the second half of life, and I had mentioned the shift from competition to cooperation. A very well-dressed man, probably could have been in his 80s, but very fit. And he came up afterward and he was almost apologizing. He said, I play tennis and I think I'm competing, as if he were beginning to realize he shouldn't be competing. And I tried to tell him, no, you can enjoy your competition in tennis, or you can enjoy it in golf, or wherever there might be a chance to compete. But once again, it's kind of the quality of what you bring to that. Like when I talked in previous podcasts about the quality of the being that we bring to the doing. I remember when I was playing competitive tennis, and one of the things I liked about it was I knew I had an opponent, but the two of us could actually be cooperating with each other in that if we both played as hard and well as we absolutely could, then we were bringing out the best in the other person. And even if the other person won or I won, we had cooperated in helping us to grow our game or to feel good about how we played, whether the result was a win or a loss. And for truth in lending, or whatever the metaphor would be, I have to admit that I like to win. Then our job in the second half of life, if we choose to accept it, is to become an elder and do what elders do for the sake of others, for the common good. And unlike in Mission Impossible, if you remember that show, if we don't accept becoming elders, it might not be the tape that self-destructs, but our world. Not to put pressure on you or anything. Our culture might not recognize us as elders, but we can still give ourselves that title when we have become one, especially with the support of other elders or anyone of any age who recognizes the value of our gifts. So we don't let someone else determine what our role is or who we're going to be as an older person in our culture. I believe the current figure is about 15,000 men and women per day that are retiring. And imagine if they all became elders and did the work of eldering that Reb Zalman pointed out. Imagine if even a third of them do. And imagine if that third goes on to graduate school, so to speak, and become sages. And remember the title of Reb Zalman's book, From Aging to Saging. And now, before wrapping up, for the first time, maybe I'm going to give a sort of a commercial instead of just an infomercial. I've billed my podcast as one to help people, to have a vital, satisfying second half of life, retirement years, and to help them with problems or issues that they have around retirement or they're growing older. And while I have mentioned this next that I'm going to say previously, I want to bring it more into focus in that I hope that many of people who have the opportunity or already are an elder, that you will think seriously about being one and doing what the elders do. And even what Reb Zalman called taking up the most rewarding work of a lifetime and becoming a sage. And if you should be thinking, me, a sage? Well, even half a sage would be a help. But don't sell yourself short too soon. And remember that you don't have to do this as the Lone Ranger. So I'll leave you with this quote to close us out from this show. It's adapted from Loving the Two Halves of Life, The Further Journey by Richard Rohr. He says, Usually without growth being forced on us, few of us go willingly on the spiritual journey. Why would we? The rug has to be pulled out from beneath our game, so we redefine what balance really is. We eventually get a feel for true balance when we fall and rise a number of times. More than anything else, this falling-rising cycle is what moves us into the second half of our own lives. All falling, no growth. Always on top, no growth. There is a necessary suffering to human life, and if we avoid its cycles, we remain immature forever. It can take the form of failed relationships, facing our own shadow self, conflicts and contradictions, disappointments, moral lapses, depression in any number of forms. All of these have the potential to edge us forward in life, or dig in our heels even deeper, producing narcissistic and adolescent responses that everybody can see except ourselves. We either fall upward, as I say in my last book, or we just keep falling.